When the urban planner Robert Moses first proposed the Cross-Bronx Expressway in 1946, the proposed plan called for the creation of a superhighway that would bisect the borough of Bronx, the northern part of a section called the South Bronx. Speaking of the project's obstacles in 1955, Robert Moses said, "When you operate in an overbuilt metropolis like New York City, you have to hack your way through with a meat axe." And this is exactly what happened with the South Bronx. The creation of this public project, this Cross-Bronx Expressway, to facilitate the transportation of suburban commuters into the city came at the cost of a very dense urban community, primarily composed of Afro-Caribbean and African-American residents at that time. When the plan was completed in 1963, more than 60,000 residents in the South Bronx had been displaced, replicating a narrative that we had already seen with the creation of Central Park, in which yet another community of color was displaced in the name of quote-unquote public good. The post-war era is this next period of intense urban change that we'll be encountering in this course. And in this lecture, we'll be telling two stories. One, about New York and the changes in culture and society that took place. Secondly, we'll be talking about the post-war era in New York, where visions of the urban futures transformed the New York City landscape for good and for worse. We have four specific questions that will structure this lecture. Number one, what role did New York City play in the war effort? Two, how did the Brooklyn Navy Yard change gender roles during that time? Three, how did so-called urban renewal shape spatial dynamics? And four, who was Jane Jacobs and how did her ideas shape the city? Some key terms that we'll be looking at are, of course, the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the trope of Rosie the Riveter, fashion really in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the UN headquarters, what is redlining, something we've already talked a little bit about during the New Deal era, and finally, the ramifications of the Housing Act of 1949. World War II really takes place in two theaters of operation, both in the Pacific and then in Europe. And America enters the war effort as early as 1941, specifically with the attack on Pearl Harbor. But we won't be talking too much about the war in particular, but rather we'll be concentrating on the domestic impact that the war had on New York City. And America enters the war effort even before it enters the war itself, specifically with the creation of various industries that would fuel the Allies' effort in this endeavor. By 1938, as the world moved ever closer to war, the local economy in New York started to pick up because of this, activating the wartime industries that it had experienced during World War I and subsequent wars before it. And in New York City, that war effort was loudly pronounced in Brooklyn, in the old Brooklyn Navy Yard along the East River. The East River had long been a terminal docking station for many ships, specifically warships, and there had been a strong naval presence along this part of the East River as well. And as Allies engaged in this global war, the United States focused its industrial potential on manufacturing wartime goods and supply for the Allied effort. With regard to New York, much of that economic activity was focused on the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And we can see this quickly ramping up to the point where the United States enters the war in 1941. In fact, 2 years before the Japanese even bombed Pearl Harbor, the Brooklyn Navy Yard employed more than 25,000 workers in its industries. The site reached its peak employment in the middle of the war, employing more than 70,000 workers, both men and women. During the war years, the Navy Yard employed more than 70,000 workers working in shifts of 20 hours a day, 7 days a week. So the engines were constantly moving day and night, 24 hours a day. And the Navy Yard in particular was highly important for the American war effort. New York Harbor became a marshalling ground, a staging ground for the launch into the European theater of operation. Half of all of the hardware, at least 1/3 of American soldiers who crossed the Atlantic Ocean during this conflict, did so through the New York Harbor. And when the war ended in 1945, New York was the largest, richest, and most important city in the world, with the Brooklyn Navy Yard as the backbone of that growth. The Brooklyn Navy Yard was responsible for manufacturing various products in the war effort. As well as huge shipbuilding facilities, the site also contained barracks for Marines, a power plant, a large radio station, as well as several machine shops and warehouses where guns and other equipment were produced on large scale. To aid this Allied war effort, Congress passed the War Manpower Commission in 1942. This commission essentially managed the civilian workforce during the war years. And immediately, from the outset of the creation of this commission, it was clear that there was a shortage in labor. This was primarily due to the fact that the military at this time was highly segregated along terms of gender and race. And this need for labor in the war effort opened up spaces and opportunities for women who, in this time in American history, were essentially sequestered to the home environment based on restrictive gender norms that hadn't really changed much since the 19th century. Women by this time in American history were expected to stay home in what is called the cult of domesticity, in which many of their daily routines had to do with housekeeping, raising the kids, among other things, supporting a patriarchal regime that in many ways still stays with us. And this labor shortage was particularly acute in terms of shipbuilding. Many of the industry's leaders struggled to keep up with the exorbitant production quotas that FDR had put in place, calling for a 70% increase in the U.S. Navy. As a consequence of the War Manpower Commission in 1942, approximately 6 million women entered the civilian labor force during the war, and approximately 3 million of those women went into defense-related industries, many of them taking up shop in the Brooklyn Navy Yard itself. And the industries in the Brooklyn Navy Yard aggressively recruited women production workers throughout the war. By January 1945, the Brooklyn Navy Yard had reached its peak employment, employing more than 5,000 women workers in Navy Yard positions that were formerly held by males. These included pipe fitters, electricians, welders, crane operators, truck drivers, sheet metal workers, and this social change was revolutionary for its time, considering the cult of domesticity, considering the host of gender norms that women were circumscribed to during the middle of the 20th century. And in the context of the entire war effort at home, shipyard workers particularly received the highest wages paid to women laborers during the war effort. These advances, however, were not without their limitation. Notably absent from this cohort of women workers were, of course, African American women. And this racial segregation, both in the military and the wartime industries, reflected the extant power dynamics of Jim Crow power regimes that continued to inform government policy, let alone society. In November 1943, the Navy actually proclaimed that the 52,000 women that they employed as production workers in the nation's United States shipyards had, quote, turned the clock of history far ahead in proving women's right to an important role in industry. Were they actually changing history or continuing the same stolid social dynamics that we had been experiencing for 2 centuries? And cultural production at that time reflected many of these racial dynamics. The image replicated throughout news media and publications of the trope of Rosie the Riveter was created with government funding to support this war effort, to support the recruitment of women into wartime industry. But it's interesting, if we analyze this trope of Rosie the Riveter, we can see many of these racial dynamics right on the face value. Rosie the Riveter as a trope, as a character created by the government, created a model for women workers in the war effort. They were invariably white, according to this image, middle class, and attractive. In reality, this profile would change by the war's end as more African American women and married women, usually with grown children, entered the wartime production. But for the majority of the war years, this trope reflected these gendered and racial dynamics. It reflected the segregation and the subjugation of black bodies in the United States that continued well after the Civil War, of course. The war effort only primed New York City's change in the aftermath of World War II. After 1945, New York was not so much a city, but a manifestation of global power. In the emerging free world, the triumphant victor in the war effort against fascism, and soon to commit itself in a much longer struggle against the Soviet Union and communism as an ideology, New York stood unabashedly for metropolitan American values. New York became a symbol in the post-war era for American values in a larger Cold War struggle that continues in some ways today. And the creation of the UN headquarters in 1947, specifically in Manhattan, symbolized this power that New York held in the post-war era. New York City was, of course, a natural choice for the headquarters of the United Nations. Major corporations had found solid reasons to relocate their headquarters to the city. Not only that, but New Deal programs had created a support structure, a social safety, on which the promise of a worker's paradise was built. But while the UN headquarters may have symbolized the emergence of New York City as a kind of capital of the world, it would be the urban renewal plans of master builder Robert Moses that would have a much sharper impact on the daily lives in New York City going forward into the end of the 20th century. This is still the New Deal era, and as we saw in previous lectures, there were many unintended consequences or not thoroughly thought out plans for the future of America based on those policies. Like many of the housing policies in the 1930s that created the practice of redlining and therefore created the emergence of a white suburbia in America, the urban renewal policies of the 1940s and 1950s had a similar devastating impact on cities. Urban renewal is associated with a host of policies that political leaders had implemented in the post-war era in an attempt to reinvigorate urban economies across the country. During the post-war era, political leaders assumed that a combination of slum clearance, handsome office towers, as well as great expressways would bring a host of middle-class people back to downtown urban centers. Once the downtown was easy to reach and attractive for suburban commuters, the argument went, well-off urbanites would want to rent corporate spaces and move into upscale apartments, therefore contributing to a rise in urban revenues, for renewing the cities economically as well as socially. And this was the case of the Housing Act of 1949. Title I of the Housing Act of 1949 provided federal funds for cities to acquire supposedly blighted areas of their urban environment for removal, clearance, and redevelopment. And as a result, many of New York City's public housing facilities, not to mention apartment complexes, were built through government aid under Title I of the Housing Act of 1949. But if we look a little bit deeper into the purposes of Title IX, we'll see a much more insidious nature. The purpose of Title I, entitled Slum Clearance and Urban Redevelopment, was to induce private investors to clear slum areas and to increase residential housing. And to some extent, it did work, bringing a host of middle-class suburban commuters back into the city, but there were also unintended consequences or ill-thought-out plans that contributed to massive devastation in New York City. Many scholars today now concur that the urban renewal projects in the 1940s and 1950s that were designed to reinvigorate decaying cities had a disproportionate negative impact on black communities, black and brown communities. And this is again a reoccurring theme that we're seeing throughout this longer arc of New York City history. That is the state-subsidized removal and clearance of black communities in the name of a so-called higher good. Great example of that is, of course, Lincoln Square, now the site of Metropolitan Opera, in addition to Fordham's Lincoln Center campus. This was another Robert Moses creation, just like the Cross Bronx Expressway. In this particular example, New York destroyed Manhattan's San Juan Hill community, a black and Puerto Rican neighborhood, to make way for Lincoln Center and the Performing Arts Center, which housed the Metropolitan Opera. So here you have San Juan Hill, a vibrant, working, and middle-class non-white community that was essentially bulldozed to make opera houses for middle-class and upper-class residents to enjoy. Not to mention for middle-class and upper-class students to attend college at Fordham University's Lincoln Center campus. This was not an isolated example. At around the same time, the city of Philadelphia bulldozed Black Bottom, a neighborhood vibrant in African American culture, to make way for the Science and Research Center attached to the University of Pennsylvania. Similarly, Chicago's Brownsville neighborhood was cut off by an expressway in the same way that we saw with the South Bronx. Whether you want to call it gentrification or public domain, this is a reoccurring theme of the federal government sponsoring the removal and essentially eradication of black people and brown people from urban centers. So many of the urban issues we're experiencing today, with regard specifically to education, to real estate and equity, not even to mention urban services, have roots long ago. And the roots of these power dynamics go back decades. Urban renewal is just one example. And if we think about Robert Moses as a kind of villain in this narrative, we might think about Jane Jacobs as a grassroots hero, organizing grassroots efforts in response to these large-scale urban renewal projects that have many devastating consequences for the trajectory of urban growth. Jane Jacobs moved to New York City in 1934 at the height of the war effort and first took a job in the Office of War Information in the State Department. And so, in a way, is part of this cast of women workers during the World War II effort, a kind of Rosie the Riveter in her own right. She then took up a job as a freelance journalist and started attending graduate school at Columbia University, focusing on the history of cities, and New York City in particular. In 1961, she wrote the landmark text on urban development called The Death and Life of Great American Cities, in which she focuses on many urban problems that New York was experiencing during the 1950s and attempts to issue a response to the large-scale urban renewal projects that Robert Moses was very well known for. Essentially, her premise in this text is that a city cannot be a work of art. Cities, by their nature, are unruly, she argues, and any large-scale program to impose order upon that chaos can only manifest in human devastation and destruction to human communities. And that's what she thought was exactly going on in the 1950s and 1960s, that communities were disintegrating because of these large-scale New Deal programs, like the Cross Bronx Expressway, more particularly with the Lomax project that we talked about earlier in the semester. In the book, for example, she talks about how abstract ideas for new parks are meaningless unless they account for the instinctive ways that residents in the area currently use those spaces, despite plans that architects or urban planners might have. Throughout the book, she documents how people use streets, and that that information should be included into large-scale urban programs that people like Robert Moses were attempting to initiate. Jacobs' insight with The Death and Life of Great American Cities provides insight into some of the urban planning that was taking place in the post-war era. Jacobs argues throughout that these large-scale urban programs were behemoths that destroyed the city's fabric by superimposing sprawling expressways, gigantic civic centers, insular public housing projects, and boxy office buildings, displacing many of the urban networks that had organically developed. Jacobs ultimately focused many of her grassroots initiatives on Robert Moses' Lomax project. Jacobs herself was instrumental in the canceling of the Lomax project, which, if it was successful, would have cut directly through the lower part of Manhattan, currently known as Soho, Little Italy, and Chinatown, eviscerating ethnic enclaves like Little Italy, like Chinatown, that were so consequential for the concentration of power among immigrants. Despite our grand efforts, Jacobs in some way also is tied to gentrification. The defeat of the Lower Manhattan Expressway project is why, for example, Soho became a flourishing artist community in the 1970s, which immediately increased rental values, displacing already ethnic minorities there. And this tactic of converting older industrial spaces into residential spaces, like what happened in Soho, is a tactic that we see play out again through the 1960s, 1970s in a broader process of urban gentrification that we still see today. So even though Jane Jacobs kind of fought gentrification, at least that gentrification that comes from grand urban renewal projects, she nonetheless is also responsible for a kind of different gentrification that ensued into the 1970s and 1980s and continues today in many ways. So some of the questions that structured our lecture today are: what role did New York City play in the war effort? How did the Brooklyn Navy Yard change gender roles or attempt to change gender roles? Of course, what are the limitations to that change as well? How did urban renewal shape spatial power dynamics in New York City? Who was Jane Jacobs, and how did her ideas shape the city? Some key terms are, of course, the Brooklyn Navy Yard, Rosie the Riveter, the UN headquarters redlining, which is something we covered before, as well as the Housing Act of 1949.